One of the impulses, of course, of many of the Brexiteers, and indeed many of those people in the Tory party, is almost the inescapability that they loved to blame the EU for all of Britain's problems. To them, this was the true problem in Britain. Not that we've had, years of austerity causing other problems. Of course, that has knock-on effects, etc., etc., and of course, really bad Tory policy, at least for the past 10 years. But it was all the EU's fault. If only we weren't part of the EU, then all our problems would go away. Surely this would be it. But of course, we are now out of the EU. We've had the first proper year of Brexit. But still, there is the impulse within many in the Tory party, and particularly the Brexit ultras, to blame the EU still, even though we are no longer in it. I always said, when it comes to this, when they start to do this, which we always knew they would, because this was always their fallback position of, oh, let's blame the EU, or let's blame the EU for this, had nothing to do with the EU at all. As we always said, many of the problems that Britain was facing even pre-2016 and even now are not EU problems. They are British problems. And as a result, only we can fix those problems. But of course, there is a very heavy reluctance to maybe admit that, because, well, then maybe they might realize, well, oh yeah, we might have caused that problem in the first place. But of course, let's get into this very interesting article, because maybe some of these people are finally waking up to this. And certainly Boris Johnson has. But of course, before we do get into that, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help support the channel that way. So, on with this. This comes from The Independent with the title of "The Russia-Ukraine Crisis Has Shown Boris Johnson That It Is the EU Is Not the Enemy and Putin Is." Crisis? What crisis? That was the apathetical line that attributed to the very embattered Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan back in the 1979. But given the events of the past week, Boris Johnson could perhaps be forgiven for asking, crisis, which crisis? Over the past 3 years, he's certainly had lots to choose from. And on Thursday, the very day that England officially moved out of its COVID crisis with the lifting of nearly all restrictions, Russian tanks rolled over the border of Ukraine. And Johnson wants out of the pandemic frying pan and walks straight into the fire of Vladimir Putin's war. A similarly unlucky train of events took place more than 2 years ago too. On the 31st of January 2020, on the day which the UK formally left the European Union and ended our years of Brexit wars, came the news of first 2 cases of coronavirus on English soil. Johnson, of course, barely had time to catch his breath, and he was plunging into the biggest global crisis since the financial crash. The pattern was indeed repeated this week as he chaired the emergency COBRA meeting about Ukraine. But what links both these dates and even the politics of Europe, and specifically of European identity, and of course, all his staunch support for Kyiv in the face of Russian aggression? For Johnson, all that remains are the uncomfortable fact that Ukraine wants to join the very club that he has left, the EU. Ukraine's revolution back in 2014 stemmed from the Euromaidan protests that was sparked when the then pro-Moscow president, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to sign a trade association agreement between the EU and his country. Unsurprisingly, Ukrainians were not too keen on Yanukovych's alternative plan to join the Eurasian Economic Union, a Soviet-style alliance of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan with a fraction of the clout of the EU. Indeed, a violent attempt to quash the Euromaidan protest, the so-called because the crowds renamed Kiev's Independence Square as Euro Square, and then waved both the Ukrainian and the EU flag. This led to a huge nationwide backlash, which ended in the toppling of Yanukovych. When Russia then annexed Crimea and triggered the armed uprisings in the east, Johnson then sparked anger among Ukrainians by appearing to blame the EU for Putin's very aggression, claiming that it was EU foreign policy making on the hoof that had caused the real trouble. And in Ukraine, he was swiftly accused of being an apologist for Putin. Johnson has also kept remarkably quiet about that particular controversy of late. And of course, he has long argued that being European doesn't mean being part of the EU. But for Ukrainian membership of the economic bloc is clearly part of that definition of identity. And while politicians talk very blithely about Putin waging the worst war in Europe since the Second World War, for many in Kyiv, that line is a bitter bitter ringing, because being European is meaningless and abstraction without the necessary trade and defense links that it has given this phrase life. The PM's very own live TV address this week notably stressed, of course, the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. Yet, as the Euromaidan protest showed, many Ukrainians see the EU membership as a means of securing their independence, not undermining it. Indeed, it is arguable that the only thing that can now remove Putin is for those close to him to realize that being cut off from European trade, finance, democratic norms, as well as football tournaments and holiday destinations, is a denial of Russia's very own European history and destiny. Once it was a pariah state, the reliance on the Chinese cash may feel like a humiliating dead end too. And of course, there is also the irony that the UK was the strongest proponent of the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet countries of it joining the EU on issues like pressuring Germany to cancel the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline or excluding Russia from the SWIFT banking system. The UK could have had a real influence if it were still in the bloc. Now, of course, to misquote the Hamilton the musical, we are no longer in the room where it happens. Brexit is just a fact of life. But the Ukraine crisis has exposed just how some of the boosts of the Vote Leave campaign have failed to materialise in practice. As the Tory MP Tom Tugnut pointed out this week on BBC's Radio 4 Today programme, Brexit was supposed to make life easier for the UK to be more agile and quicker in imposing tough sanctions. Yet, Brussels not only acted more quickly than London in sanctioning members of the Russian parliament, the UK obviously still has a major presence thanks to its NATO membership and G7 membership, its nuclear arsenal, and its status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Yet, Brexit's mission statement of a global Britain has just been undermined by aid cuts and cuts to the armed forces that Johnson broke back in a 2019 election promise not to reduce the size of the army. Only this week, the General Sir Richard Sheriff, formerly the NATO Deputy Supreme Commander, said, "I'm afraid the cupboard is pretty bare after the cumulative defence cuts of the last decade." That much heralded pivot of our foreign policy towards the Far East and away from Europe is looking very increasingly unwise, especially to some Tory MPs, given that the Russian threat, similarly trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, are quietly ridiculed by backbenchers who then clock that they produce a fraction of trade that we have with the EU. And of course, there are signs of a switch back to the focus on Europe. However, Johnson will, on the 8th of March, host a meeting of the leaders of Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia in London to discuss the situation in Ukraine and UK support for security in the region. The UK's role as the biggest armed NATO presence in Estonia is another source of pride for the MP, and more British troops are expected to be deployed across the EU's eastern border. He and the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace are indeed determined that the UK should be a major supplier of anti-aircraft and other defensive weapons for Ukraine troops. Although that may be tragically too late to prevent Putin's carve-up of the country, it could indeed fuel the anti-Russian resistance for years. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is also seen by the EU as a far more constructive partner than Lord Frost in her talks about the sorting the Northern Ireland Protocol issue that has caused the real friction. Truss has also made it her task to visit as many EU capitals as possible for bilateral talks on a range of issues of multilateral interest. Some backbenchers do believe that the Ukraine crisis has proved to the PM the value of building alliances with European partners rather than wrecking them for just cheap headline in the pro-Brexit newspapers, as has happened over the fish wars with France and, of course, the sausage wars with the EU itself. Slowly, it does appear that number 10 is realizing that the real enemy is not Brussels bureaucrats, but it is the common enemy of the gangster state that is Putin's Kremlin and phony wars that are put into brutal context by real ones. Johnson's instinct has been to say that going it alone is the best choice for the UK. But a modern day crisis, whether it is the COVID pandemic, the climate change threat, or a dictator's invasion, can only be tackled through cooperation and collaboration. Most importantly, life outside the huge economic superpower means that teamworking and diplomacy is actually more important, not less. The Prime Minister now has a chance to prove that he get that basic point of the post-Brexit fact. So, as you can see, it's been a very, very interesting week, filled with lots of very interesting contradictions over here, with that, shall we say, realization that many Tory MPs are suddenly feeling very, very worried, as we saw twice, indeed, this week, about them worrying about the pivot to the east, while the problem is existing currently in Europe. And that was brought up not only by Labour members, but also a lot of Tory members as well. And there are, again, rumours on the backbench that, hey, all that trade that we got with, Australia and New Zealand, as was mentioned in the article, is but a fraction of what, we've lost with the EU and what we actually do with the EU itself. So there are signs, slowly but surely, that maybe the worm is indeed starting to turn. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button down below if you are new. And, of course, there are links down below for my Patreon page and a donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And, as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.